it's really a ramping up, and I think it's timely in the sense that the Russians can see that there may, these negotiations may happen, and they want to have take back that territory so that they've got it going into, if there's a freeze of the battlefield, they have it back and they won't have to hold it against a renewed offensive from the Ukrainian side.
Okay, Catherine Philp, Times World Affairs editor. Welcome back to the World in 10. Let's start by talking about President Volodymyr Zelensky in Saudi Arabia. He's going to be meeting MBS, isn't he? And then also meeting his team ahead of what will be the first talks between America and Ukraine since the Oval Office row. But interestingly, he's not going to be part of those talks. What's the point of him being there and then leaving before the talks happen? Why wouldn't he want to be part of it?
Yeah, so Zelensky, yeah, he's gone to Saudi Arabia. He was supposed to go just before the US Russia talks happened in Saudi last time, and he left because he hadn't been invited. Now, from a strictly protocol point of view, he shouldn't be at a meeting which is chaired by the U.S. Secretary of State Rubio, because he's a president of a country, and so his own foreign minister, will be going in his place. His visit to Washington was sort of about that, to try and ratchet things up to president level. And in fact, it was one of the complaints of the Ukrainian side about why that meeting descended into such acrimony, was that JD Vance inserted himself into it, and there were some pointed remarks from the Ukrainians that it was meant to be a president meeting, so they felt that that level was inappropriate, and of course did not do Zelensky any favors. That meeting might have gone very differently if Vance hadn't been there, because it was really his intervention that kicked things off. So Zelensky is going there to demonstrate his readiness for such negotiations, his presence. Meeting MBS is quite smart, because that's someone that the Trump administration have endorsed and see as a sort of worthy mediator, and he's obviously someone who actually can speak to all sides in this. And sort of drum roll, we may be expecting to see a signature on that fraught minerals deal, which only Zelensky can sign. So I think that's the purpose of him being there. It's a sort of reset. But yes, the main, the guts of the deal will not be debated by Zelensky. It will be done by his team.
Well, as you mentioned, then the first talk since the Oval Office debacle, also the first talk since the US intel sharing was paused. We'll come on to the sort of direct impact of that shortly, but it is clear, basically it's been negative for Ukraine, of course. How will that have impacted their planning for these talks, and what tone, given that, do you expect Zelensky to instruct his team to take?
Well, there is a brutal efficiency to what's been done in the withdrawal of both military aid and intelligence sharing, because it's really put Ukraine in a position where it has absolutely no choice but to enter these negotiations. It's already having an impact on the battlefield, as you know, and it is. I think, in particular, the intelligence sharing. I think that's the really fraught part of this. That there is a school of military thought that says that the nature of the battlefield had changed so greatly that Ukraine could continue for some time without US military support. But the intelligence sharing really has left Ukraine fighting blind. So I think that this will obviously put them in quite a conciliatory mood. We know from Kyiv that their suggestion that they want to put something on the table to take the initiative, and that will be a suggestion of a sort of ceasefire, not on the ground, but in the air and at sea. Now, in the air would be very helpful to the Ukrainians who've taken a pounding from airstrikes in the last week or so. And at sea, that would seem to be an olive branch from Ukraine to Russia, because Ukraine has no navy and yet has almost effectively closed down the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. It's been so effective at striking it, and the Black Sea Fleet has had to be moved out of Crimea to get away from Ukrainian fire. So that's their starting point for how they might be able to go forward with this.
Um, Over the weekend, the UK's National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, went to Ukraine, didn't he, to brief Zelensky on handling these talks.
Yeah.
When you think back a couple of weeks ago, so Keir Starmer's visit to Washington was sort of the only one really where people came out with a real positive sense. You know, when you think that there was the three in a row, wasn't there? Macron, Starmer, and then Zelensky. But so if the UK is sort of trying to give advice to Ukraine, I'm trying to think what they can offer beyond just how to charm Donald Trump. Is that really the only advice that Britain can offer Volodymyr Zelensky?
Well, I mean, I'd hope we could offer more. I mean, I think that a lot of people have been, pleasantly surprised by Starmer, the efficacy of Starmer's diplomatic efforts, given that he doesn't have much experience of this. But Jonathan Paul does. He was indeed involved, intimately involved in the very difficult negotiations to strike a peace in Northern Ireland. And so he has a lot of experience in talking to very, very difficult people indeed, including proscribed terrorists. The Putin regime in Moscow is, let's not forget, headed up by an indicted war criminal. So and yet one to whom of whom very little has been asked so far. It's all been asked of Ukraine. So I suspect that's Paul will be bringing his expertise in that very difficult negotiation to bear, and telling Zelensky really, how he might be able to advance his own interests in a non-confrontational manner, and in a manner that may, attract the Trump administration and think that he might have something to give.
I want to come sort of back to the intel sharing, because last night on Air Force One, Donald Trump suggested he had, and this is a quote, just about ended the suspension of intel sharing with Ukraine. You know, it's been literally a few days, hasn't it? What do you think the point of that was? Was this like, look what war would be like without us, and so come with a weaker stance when you have these
I
talks?
mean, he says just about. I mean, Trump and words. I think what he's by saying that, I think all it really means is uh, that this is, that he's making it very, very clear that it's a bargaining chip and it could resume, and that there's a possibility of it resuming. But yes, look what we've seen. I mean, it can't. I wouldn't have thought it's much fun for him to see what has happened in Ukraine without it. But considering he is one who talks so much about wanting to not see these beautiful lives thrown away, and to stop the killing, there's been little but since that happened. But I think that Donald Trump is indicating there that it could be resumed, and fast, if his conditions are fulfilled.
You've spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine. You must have seen and heard directly the impact that US intelligence can have.
Yeah.
Can you give us, the idea of how that intelligence comes in, how quickly it can be utilized, and what the damage would be in any given scenario of
Yeah.
not having it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that we've seen over the last few days is that the US medium range rocket launchers, HIMARS, so the multiple rocket launch systems, that they use a lot of US satellite imaging and other intelligence in their targeting. And I don't think they've been used at all in the last few days since that was paused. So that really reduces Ukraine's strike capacity inside Russia. It's less of an issue on the front line when you're talking about like shorter range mortar fire or artillery fire. When you're looking at the longer range, the medium range firing, it means that Ukraine is either blind to the artillery positions or the missile positions of the Russians, or it is just compromised in its ability to locate them and then fire upon them. So that's tricky. I mean, they do. There is a lot of there's a lot of first person surveillance drones as well as attack drones being used, and that is uh, one way that they can get some sights on the ground, but there's a limit to how far into the back of the firing range those go. So that's the main thing.
And we're also hearing today, aren't we, reports of that Ukrainian troops are entirely now surrounded in Kursk. Is that all part of this? I mean, it cannot be coincidence that it hasn't happened before, and then in 4 or 5 days, suddenly Russia and the Russian troops have managed to entirely surround Kursk.
I think that has, although the intelligence sharing won't have helped, I think that is actually more to do with the Russian tactics. So I think it's possibly not surprising. You know, a lot of people, I was just talking to people over the weekend who were saying in the UK, was saying, you know, why have the Russians allowed the Ukrainians to be inside their territory for so long? And I think there was a desire not to let up on the east, the push on the east. So in places like Pokrovsk, but also I think that it's possible that Russia has waited until there are negotiations underway or about to happen in order to dislodge the Ukrainians from there. Because one of the reasons the Ukrainians went in was so that they would have a piece of Russian territory potentially to swap in peace negotiations with their own territory that had been occupied by the Russians. So if the Russians wait till now to go in and they can push the Ukrainians back, they may not need to hold that area so long. So it would that they do appear to have rushed a lot more resources to the front line to do that. Now, I mean, they have been in the past. I've maybe only 10 days ago was speaking to people in Sumy, Ukrainian soldiers who'd been inside Kursk, and they said this was an ever-present danger of being encircled. And in fact, so one guy I spoke to was talking about how they had become encircled and that they were led out by the only safe route, which a drone led them out from. So drones operate in that way as well, and that a great number of his unit were actually killed in that way. So it's really a ramping up, and I think it's timely in the sense that the Russians can see that there may, these negotiations may happen, and they want to have take back that territory so that they've got it going into if there's a freeze of the battlefield, they have it back and they won't have to hold it against a renewed offensive from the Ukrainian side.
So we're to assume really that this is it for Ukrainian troops in Russia now potentially. That's that really.
I think that's what they're certainly what the Russians are aiming to do. I mean, there were a lot of North Koreans were thrown in there and then fared quite badly. More have gone. We understand they are fighting differently to the Russians. They are fighting in a pretty suicidal manner, which is different to the way the Russians were previously fighting, which was sort of in pushing small groups forward at times. So, yeah, I think that is what the Russians are trying to do. I think they are trying to take it back and take it back for good. So to be in that position before that freeze on the battlefield happens.
I just want to touch finally on a bit of a tangent, really, and that's an extraordinary interview given to Le Figaro in France by JD Vance's cousin,
Yeah.
Nate, who it turns out was a volunteer fighter in Ukraine on the front line. He's given this extraordinary interview during which he's attacked the president and his cousin, the vice president. He's called them Putin's useful idiots. He's called the Oval Office incident an ambush, and he's warned President Trump and Vance that they are wrong to think they can placate Putin. He says because they won't forget the US's support for Ukraine in Russia. What do we know about his experience? How much credibility does he have as a fighter, first and foremost?
Well, I mean, from what I've seen, just in from his history of his deployment, where he's been to all the hotspots in the east. He's been to Bakhmut and Pokrovsk. So I he'll have seen more than I have, and I feel like I've seen quite a lot there. Yeah, he will have an idea about what he's talking about. It's very interesting to me that he was a U.S. Marine, and that's his background, because of course Vance was too. He joined the Marines out of high school, and he parlayed and fought in Iraq. He and saw the folly of that war on the ground. I think Ukraine is a rather different war, and so that his JD Vance's comparisons may not be entirely valid. But yeah, he used that to he used the Marines as a springboard to get into law school, and get those advantages you do from being in the military. But so I think it's I mean, they're cousins. I have no idea how close they are, but he comes from this similar background to Vance, and I think he's probably trying to appeal to that. I think it's particularly interesting that he's spoken out now after the one of the particular disagreements that was had in the Oval Office was that Zelensky pointed out to JD Vance that he'd never actually been to Ukraine, and Vance replied, "Well, you just take people on propaganda tours," which is pretty harsh. And I think that was one of the things that really set Zelensky off after that. Actually, he was pretty wounded by that. So Nate Vance is really coming out and saying, well, I haven't been on a propaganda tour. I've fought on the front line, and this is what it's like. So in those terms, I think it's a pretty good riposte to the notion that Zelensky is not telling the truth about the front line.
So just finally on that, do you think someone with his credibility, but also the closeness to the vice president, and he was in this interview sort of quite positive about Vance as a man, talked about him being a clever man, and that there were some sort of niceties before he went on the attack. So the fact that he's obviously got a close relationship with him, or has had possibly before this, I wonder whether that might make his message land in America at all. Would there be suddenly a little bit more of a swell of support for Ukraine, given this specific person coming in and saying this?
I mean, I think that's tough, because Vance, I don't know much about his relationship with his cousin, but his cousin went out there. My understanding was that it went out there 3 years ago, almost as soon as the conflict had began. It's hard to believe they haven't had this conversation before. And we know that Vance said about the same time that his cousin would have gone out there that he didn't care what happened to Ukraine one way or another. So I suspect this is an issue on which things get slightly tricky around the Thanksgiving table, because they clearly have very different views of this. And Vance's objections to the war in Ukraine kind of that they are on an ideological level, or a sort of, they're not on a human level like Nate Vance is. They're not it's not about that experience. It's about this belief that America shouldn't be in these places, and shouldn't go around throwing its weight around the world. And so I fear that JD Vance's experience of being in Iraq, which would be a very good grounds for being anti-American interventionist, I fear that experience of his in Iraq will speak louder to him than his cousins.